name's Andrea Chlebak, and I'm a supervising and senior colorist based in Los Angeles, California. I hope everybody is staying safe and healthy and sane during this crazy, crazy time. Our film community is super important to me, and I'm so thrilled to have the chance to work with FilmLight and be a part of this channel of theirs to just connect and share some thoughts during this time. I was really trained to be a colorist by a DP, just in how to light a scene, how to pace, the kinds of things you do in a color grading session, really all kind of guided from the DP in terms of telling a story through light and the frame. And I kind of took it from there. After that, I kind of went into lots of features, some series work, lots of music videos and commercials, and just kind of kept rolling until I had the opportunity to move to Los Angeles and kind of just keep that going. And so now I'm here. So if I'm going to start with ACEs on a project, for example, something that doesn't have a workflow pre-designated, here's an image I have from DP Alyssa Rooney, who's graciously offered this for me for a demonstration, so thanks, Alyssa. Here I'm just going to show you what I might do if I was going to give ACEs a whirl in a new film. So setting up with a working color space as ACEs CCT. I generally, I'm going to start with that one because I like the toe on that one. Again, just depends on the film. Setting into this RRT, just now that's going to allow me to automatically change my viewing color space without having to worry about that conversion, so that anytime I choose a display, it'll automatically change that for me in the timeline. Again, I've designated this as Area Log C, and now you can see in the stack it's working in ACES CCT. And then just to get out of there, I'm going to turn on the viewing color space, which would be the designated monitor that I'm using. So let's say that's Rec 709 today. And I'm going to just kind of give that a whirl, just in terms of what's going on with the color. And you can see here that I have the color space journey turned on in my workspace. I always have this. It gives me a really good, just a quick check of how the image is being transformed, and if there's a variety of color spaces, different cameras being used, and I know that they're coming in and being converted in the right way. Again, I don't always have that super visible, but it's a great thing to have, just that you can keep in your back pocket as you're working in case something looks a little bit weird as you're grading, which does happen sometimes. So again, and that just kind of gives me an overall sense. I usually will then spend some time to kind of play around with what I know that look is supposed to look like, or what I know that the DP, the director, is looking for, and I'll see if I can get that to work in ACES. Sometimes it's not possible. It just depends on, sometimes there's certain colors in an image or how they're captured that just, they don't have that same roll-off that somebody's looking for. So I'm not going to determine this up front unless somebody's interested in me using that. But again, that would be just kind of how I set it up. This way too, if you have, the work already set up in ACES and this is kind of how you have the pipeline, then if you want to save that off, you do your first trim and then you say, I want to do another version in P3, then all you have to really do is save that off and change the viewing color space, and then you do a new trim with that new display. And you don't necessarily have to worry about all of your stack that, all the grades that you've previously done. Now you see that your grades are kind of intact in ACES and you can just change the color space and the output. Again, typically you're doing a bit of a trim on the way out of that, but it gets you very close, about 90% there, if that's what you're doing. Now, if I'm not going to do ACES workflow and say I have a LUT already, then I'm going to set up a little bit differently. Again, I love identifying the input in the timeline as I'm going, so everything's very clear, just in terms of the color space I'm using. So I start with Area Log C still, so I know that. But I now have a LUT that I've created in 709 of a look that I like for this film, and then I'm going to have just the True Light applied, which is the LUT applied in that color space, and then I'm going to just identify it quickly as 709. That way, we can change the color space like I would be doing in an ACES workflow, but that conversion is only happening on the outside of my LUT that I've already created. shooting multiple looks for film, generally in my early days or a couple of hours ahead of the major grade, I like to play around with a variety of different looks. Now, of course, I've done some pretty extreme ones here just for the sense of displaying what I want to talk about. But I like to use in Baselight the scratch pad tool, or the ability to look at multiple looks across multiple cursors. So here I would just show you kind of a preview of that. So essentially, if I have you know, a shot or a look or two that I'm working on, I like to, like, you know, kind of just go through and develop something quite diverse. And then, you know, it allows me to like show and display a variety of different shots with that look as we go through, just to kind of get, you know, the filmmaker into a bit of a headspace of creating and looking at things anew. And I really love the tool set of being able to kind of like, you know, search through, look through an image that you like, okay, I really like the look of that, and sort of see how that's working through, and then to kind of play with, say, a variety of different looks. I know this is a film called Compulsion. It's a short film by director Brian Sapancic, who's a friend of mine. Thanks, Brian, for letting me use this. I know he likes Blade Runner, so I just picked this shot to play with a little bit and get a sense. So once I find something that you know, I like, or I think is kind of interesting, then I'll get into a little bit more of just the play around how I might refine that look, or develop something a little bit more, you know, kind of custom to the, you know, the kind of overall mood board and that sort of thing that we're trying to develop. And then I just kind of like work it from there. So I usually start pretty extreme and different, and then like to have those kind of available for me at all times, so we can kind of shuttle through them as we're working. And again, I usually use a scratch pad, but you can definitely use just the multi-cursors, having a timeline just for look setup, that you can have a variety of different looks that you may shuttle through, and then you know, kind of zone in on one or two and kind of work from there and refine. Day, or my kind of setup structure of an overall look and grade layering, I don't typically use curves, RGB curves, in my initial setup. I'm not 100% sure why. It just hasn't been one of the tool sets that I've found really intuitive in terms of how speedy that I like to work. And for me, I find that adjusting curves is quite natural, using the shadows, mids, and highlights of film grade, using the base grade kind of up front to really get and cue in where the black and the white is, and what that overall curve looks like. And even the video grade, depending again on the image source and kind of like how I want to interact with it. Typically I work with curves in that sense. That said, I usually, when I get into the more looky parts of the process, that's generally where I bring in the curve grade. So I really like using curves to pull apart the channels. That's a hard one. Ultimately, I think that Baselight is probably the most intuitive for me in terms of just like the interactivity of the software, how you're working with it, how quickly it is to kind of bounce back and forth and find images on the timeline to compare, at the same time to show up on the screen and to collaborate with your client, the filmmakers, which can really help in a remote sense, just kind of how fast that is. You know, when I first was looking at the different platforms early in my career, I was struck initially by FilmLight in terms of the image that you're working on is the same image that the DP and the director are looking at. And that seems like a no-brainer, and that a lot of software does do that. But to me, there's a big difference between working off of the screen and having your cursor show up and picking off the same screen that everybody's looking at, versus looking at a smaller monitor on your work surface, and then looking back up and sort of sharing the view with everybody. And to me, it's just a flow thing, and it kind of creates just the kind of style of grading session that I really like to command. That goes sort of twofold with the surface, so the blackboard 1 and 2. I think that that to me has been, one of the things that I sit down and immediately kind of feels like an extension of me and as I'm working. So, I'll sometimes go through hours of working where I actually don't even look at the board or the monitor at all. I'm just looking at the film, just like the DP, just like the director. And it, to me, just kind of creates a more immersive experience, something that's just, has more flow, and it's just, I don't know, it's just more elegant and smooth. So for me, when I'm setting up my scenes to do some look development, it's become really important for me to set up my layering order in a specific way. By that I mean just that I've developed a bit of a code in terms of what I do as a function or operation on each layer. Not necessarily all the way to, layer 100, but it's more so that my first 1 to, say, 6 layers are generally identified with the same kind of functionality. And that can be anything that you decide you want to do. For me, I just like to get my balance and my overall kind of curve done in layer 1 and 2. So I set my base grade in layer 1. That's usually where I do most of my overall kind of establishing the luminance and exposure. And then I do a bit of my balance work, and then specific like keying or hue shifting, where overall a look is going to benefit from that kind of effect in my first few layers. And then sometimes what I'll do is identify certain elements, mostly again for look development, because this wouldn't necessarily work across everything, but just different elements that I think I'm going to use in terms of what I'm going to key and how I'm going to affect the image, what kind, in the sense of, what might be interesting. And then that all kind of culminates to something that I haven't been using that much, but I think it's kind of an interesting tool in terms of look development, because FilmLight has these kind of scene looks and display looks that they've always had in the software. And while I don't use them ever full on, sometimes they're really interesting just to kind of cue and turn the image a little bit in a different way that you might not expect. And then what you can do is work, to get something unique, you can work in a way of what you're feeding into the image. Sometimes, for example, if you saturate the image going in to that look, then you can actually kind of play with this effect kind of coming out, and then, layer in again something that you like that's sort of just going to tweak in that look to a place that you like. Well, when it comes to working remotely, I don't think a lot of us have much of a choice right now. But it's interesting because it's been bringing up a lot of questions for me in terms of what I love about what I do. And of course, I love working with people, and I love spending, days or weeks with the same people to sort of develop the look and get through the grade of the film and, get to know everybody and learn a ton. And I just find that, that part, I think, is what a lot of people are concerned about being missed in this kind of move to remote working. For me, I've been doing remote work for a while now, and not necessarily just in this time, but, over the last number of years with just DPs moving on to different projects or being in different places when it comes time for the color grade. And so I find that just sort of like getting a lot of discussion going before the actual sessions, and, doing a lot of, just doing a lot of collaboration, a lot of back and forth, so that when you get into your remote session, it's more of a continuing of a conversation. And also kind of like a focused energy, we do a lot of work that we could do in isolation as colorists. I feel like, the matching of images, things that are very, I always like to think of being meditative, methodical, work that doesn't necessarily have to be supervised. I think that's interesting to be able to sort of siphon that off and create a bit of a different kind of structure for how we might work compared to how we have been working. best tip I could give somebody that's aspiring would be to study images from the point of visually, i.e., photographs, other films, paintings, anything, you name it. But also from the perspective of how an image makes you feel when you look at it. So that going from just identifying what certain colors are doing emotionally, so that you can kind of create a measure in your own body for when you're putting too much or too little color on an image. I always say that, when I get goosebumps watching a film, it's usually because of the sound. And I find that it's something that we often don't do, is sort of like listen and watch a film before we just kind of go into applying color. And I always like to watch the film with sound, really so that I don't overdo it, so that I'm not competing with something that's going on.